A security guard with that suit? He barely looks qualified to open the front door, let alone guard it. Edward Langston didn't lower his voice when he said it. In fact, he made sure the whole lobby heard. And just like that, everything changed. Jalen Morris didn't flinch. He didn't respond. He simply held out a visitor badge, calm, precise, silent. What Edward didn't know was that behind that silent gaze stood a man fluent in 11 languages, who once negotiated peace terms between 3 nations. A man who had dined with diplomats and translated under UN banners. Now wearing a plain security uniform, standing in a marble lobby, being dismissed like an entry-level temp. But today, the man Edward just called unqualified would become the one person who could save everything he'd ever built, and it would cost him more than he ever imagined. The marble floor of Langston Tower's grand lobby gleamed like ice beneath the morning light. Polished chrome turnstiles blinked red as Edward Langston, founder and CEO of Langston Holdings, stormed in wearing a tailored gray suit worth more than most people's annual salary. His polished shoes clicked with authority. But the turnstile didn't move. "Are you kidding me?" Edward barked. "I don't have time for this." From behind the sleek black security desk, Jalen Morris stood and walked over, posture straight, presence calm. His uniform was crisp, his movements quiet and deliberate. "Good morning, sir. Your badge expired yesterday. I can issue you a temporary one." Edward scoffed, barely glancing at the man. How hard can it be? Even someone as stupid as you should be able to figure it out. The word stupid hung in the air like a slap. Everything stopped, and in turn froze mid-sip of her coffee. A cluster of executives hesitated by the elevators. Savannah Brooks, a project lead heading to a product review on the 27th floor, stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes shifted to Jalen, but Jalen didn't move. No flare of emotion, no rebuttal, just the slightest tightening of his jaw. Then, with a few keystrokes, he silently reset the badge system and handed Edward a temporary pass. "There?" Edward snapped, stepping through. Was that so hard? He didn't wait for an answer. He never did. The doors closed behind him. The lobby exhaled, but something had shifted. Not in Jalen's face, not in his posture, but in the eyes of those watching. Savannah lingered, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as if something didn't quite add up, because they all knew Jalen. He was the man who smiled every morning, who remembered your name, your favorite coffee, who calmly de-escalated 2 shouting vendors last week with barely a raised voice. But no one knew what he was truly capable of. Not yet, and certainly not Edward Langston. What Edward Langston didn't know was that Jalen Morris had already been the unsung hero of the morning, quietly handling situations that would have otherwise derailed the day's important meetings. Earlier, when the first delegation arrived, the Japanese executives for the afternoon's crucial meeting had approached Jalen's desk, looking visibly confused. "Excuse me," Yamamoto-san had said hesitantly. "Conference room location?" Without missing a beat, Jalen looked up and replied in perfect Japanese. "Yamamoto-san, the main conference room is on the 20th floor. The elevators are just around the corner." Yamamoto-san's eyes widened in surprise and delight. "Ah, you speak Japanese. Arigatou gozaimasu. Do atashimashite," Jalen replied with a slight bow. The seamless interaction had set a positive tone for the visiting executives. But in the busy morning rush, no one from upper management had witnessed it. An hour later, the pattern repeated when a group of German engineers arrived, arguing loudly among themselves about directions. One of them approached Jalen's desk with obvious frustration. Jalen smiled warmly and responded fluently, "Good morning." The Germans exchanged amazed glances. "Fantastic," the lead delegate exclaimed. Savannah Brooks, who had been rushing past with her coffee during the French interaction, slowed down and stared at Jalen with newfound curiosity. She lingered near the desk, clearly intrigued. "Jalen," she whispered when the delegates had moved on, "how many languages do you actually speak?" Jalen smiled modestly, just enough to help when needed. But Savannah was the only one paying attention to these remarkable displays of linguistic skill. The rest of the company continued their morning routines, oblivious to the extraordinary talent stationed at their front desk. Hours later, Edward finally stormed through the turnstile after Jalen had quietly overridden the system for him. "See, was that so hard?" Edward sneered before disappearing into the elevator, leaving Jalen standing alone at his post. The lobby gradually returned to its normal buzz of activity, but the tension lingered. Employees exchanged sympathetic glances toward Jalen, their expressions speaking volumes about how they felt witnessing their beloved security guard's public humiliation. Word of the incident spread quickly through the building like wildfire. By lunch, everyone knew the CEO had just humiliated the one person who greeted them with a smile every morning and made them feel safe every night. But while gossip traveled through the office floors, Edward Langston was about to discover that his morning outburst would have consequences far beyond a momentary loss of dignity. Back in his corner office, Edward was still seething from the turnstile incident. The encounter with Jalen had left him feeling foolish, and Edward Langston absolutely hated feeling foolish. In his mind, the solution was simple: remove the source of his embarrassment. A security guard who can't even manage basic badge procedures. Edward muttered to himself, pacing behind his mahogany desk. How did we end up with someone so incompetent? He jabbed the intercom button. "Get me Clarice Morris from HR now." When Clarice arrived, Edward didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need Jalen Morris replaced immediately." Clarice looked surprised. "The security guard? What's the issue, Edward? He's clearly not qualified for the position. Took him forever to figure out a simple badge issue this morning. I need someone with actual intelligence handling our building security. Someone who can think on their feet, handle complex situations." "Sir, Jalen has an excellent record with no complaints." "I don't care about his record." Edward cut her off. "I need competence, not mediocrity. Replace him with someone who actually has the intellectual capacity for the job." Clarice hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the directive. "I'll start the process, but it'll take a few hours to arrange a replacement and handle the paperwork. Make it happen today. I want him gone before the afternoon meetings." What Edward Langston didn't realize was that those afternoon meetings were about to become the most important and disastrous hours of his professional life. An hour later, the atmosphere in the lobby had shifted dramatically. Jalen was quietly clearing out his desk while a hastily hired replacement security guard watched from nearby, looking overwhelmed and uncertain. Employees gathered in small clusters throughout the space, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of shock and disbelief. "They're actually firing Jalen?" Savannah Brooks asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "The CEO ordered it personally," someone whispered back. "Said he wasn't smart enough for the job." "Smart enough?" Another employee scoffed. "Jalen's the most helpful person in this building." Meanwhile, 27 floors above the brewing discontent, Edward was facing his own crisis. His regular professional interpreter had called in sick at the last minute, leaving him scrambling with a backup who was clearly struggling with the technical terminology needed for the international negotiations. The afternoon meetings were supposed to be Langston Holdings' crowning achievement, a series of complex international partnerships that would expand the company's footprint across Europe and Asia. Instead, Edward found himself watching his carefully planned presentations begin to unravel. "Mr. Langston," Yamamoto-san said politely but firmly in the main conference room, "perhaps we should postpone. The technical terminology is very important for our $15 million partnership." Edward's stomach dropped. This was the biggest international expansion in company history, and it was falling apart in real time. "Give me 5 minutes," Edward said desperately, his confident CEO facade beginning to crack. "I'll find someone better." But as he frantically called interpretation services from his office, getting only busy signals and no one available responses, his situation went from bad to worse. Just then, his assistant burst into his office without knocking, something that would normally result in immediate termination. But the look of urgency on her face stopped him mid-dial. "Sir, the German and French delegations just arrived early," she said breathless. "They're downstairs asking for that security guard who helped them this morning." Edward looked up from his phone, confused. The security guard? What are you talking about? They said he spoke perfect German and French. They specifically want him to help with the technical discussions because they were so impressed with his professionalism this morning. Edward stared at her blankly, his mind struggling to process this information. That's impossible. He's just a security guard who can't even handle a badge scanner properly. Sir, they're very insistent. The German engineer said he was the most professional translator they'd encountered. They're refusing to proceed without him. A cold realization began creeping over Edward like ice water in his veins. Get Jalen Morris up here immediately. His assistant's face fell. Sir, we can't. You had him terminated an hour ago. He's already left the building. The phone slipped from Edward's hand as the full magnitude of his mistake hit him. But before he could fully absorb what he'd done, the international executives were about to make their position crystal clear. Edward rushed back to the conference room, his mind racing as he tried to formulate an explanation. But the moment he walked in, he could see that his carefully cultivated relationships were hanging by a thread. Yamamoto-san stood up slowly, his expression grave. Stop, he said firmly. This is unacceptable. Where is the security gentleman from this morning? Jalen-san. He's not available, Edward stammered. His usual commanding presence completely evaporated. Not available? The German engineer's frown deepened. He was the most professional translator we've encountered in years. We specifically request his participation in these negotiations. Edward felt sweat beginning to form on his brow. But he's just a security guard, he said weakly, the word sounding hollow even to himself. Security guard? The French delegate raised an eyebrow, his tone indicating Edward had just said something deeply offensive. That man has UN-level linguistic expertise. His cultural understanding and professional demeanor were exceptional. We insist on his participation. The room fell silent as Edward's face went white. UN-level expertise. The man he had just fired for being not smart enough had UN-level expertise. I'm afraid that's impossible, Edward Langston began, but the French delegate cut him off. Then this meeting is impossible, he declared, standing up with finality. Edward watched in horror as his international executives, and $15 million in partnerships, began walking toward the door. Wait, Edward called out, his voice cracking with desperation. I can get him back. The executives paused at the door. Yamamoto-san turned slowly. You can? Then please do so immediately. We will not proceed without Jalen-san's expertise. Edward ran from the conference room, his expensive shoes clicking frantically against the marble floors of Langston Tower as he rushed down to the lobby. He found Jalen's replacement at the security desk, looking lost and overwhelmed by the electronic systems. Where's Jalen Morris? Edward demanded, breathing heavily. He was terminated, sir. Left about 20 minutes ago. The replacement stammered. Edward's blood ran cold. In his arrogance, he had fired the one man who could save his company. With trembling fingers, he dialed Jalen's number. Jalen, it's Edward Langston. I need you back immediately. The international executives are demanding you specifically. There was a pause on the other end. I'm sorry, Mr. Langston, but I was just terminated. I'm currently in my car heading home. I'm not sure what you're referring to. I'm reinstating you. I'll triple your salary. Please, the entire deal depends on you. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Jalen's calm voice returned. I'll be there in 30 minutes. An hour later, Jalen walked back into the Langston Holdings building to find a scene that took his breath away. The entire lobby had erupted in spontaneous applause. Employees had gathered from multiple floors to welcome back their beloved security guard, their faces beaming with genuine joy and relief. Jalen, Savannah Brooks called out from the crowd. We're so glad you're back. Others joined in with shouts of, we missed you. The outpouring of affection was overwhelming, and Jalen felt tears prick his eyes. He hadn't realized how much his quiet presence had meant to so many people. Edward met Jalen at the security desk, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away and replaced by something Jalen had never seen before. humility. Jalen, Edward said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. How many languages do you actually speak? Jalen looked at the man who had called him stupid just hours earlier. 11, sir. Edward's jaw dropped. 11 languages? How is that possible? I was a UN translator for 15 years, sir. I worked in Tokyo, Berlin, Paris, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Cairo, Geneva, Brussels, New York, and Vienna. The lobby fell silent as employees processed this revelation. Edward felt the ground shift beneath him. You are a translator? He whispered. But why? Why are you working security here? Jalen's voice remained steady, but Edward could hear the pain beneath the surface. My wife became ill 2 years ago, stage 4 cancer. We needed immediate health insurance and to be close to her family here in the city. Langston Holdings offered both. Is she? Edward couldn't finish the question. She passed last year, sir. The silence stretched between them. Edward drowning in shame and regret. Jalen standing with quiet dignity, despite everything he'd endured. I called you stupid? Edward whispered, the words heavy with remorse. Yes, sir, you did. Edward took a deep breath. The executives are waiting upstairs. They refuse to proceed without you. I understand, sir. Jalen entered the main conference room to find all 3 international delegations waiting expectantly. The moment he appeared, the entire atmosphere shifted. Jalen-san, Yamamoto-san exclaimed in Japanese, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. The pleasure is entirely mine, Yamamoto-san, Jalen replied in perfect Japanese, his slight bow showing deep respect for cultural protocol. The German engineer stood up immediately. Jalen, we desperately need your expertise with the technical specifications. Our previous translator was struggling with the engineering terminology. Of course, Jalen responded in flawless German, his accent so perfect that the Germans exchanged impressed glances. I'll be happy to help clarify any technical details. The French delegate smiled broadly. We refuse to proceed without you. Merci, Jalen replied smoothly, his French carrying the sophisticated tone of someone who had spent years in diplomatic circles. Edward watched in amazement from the corner of the room as Jalen seamlessly facilitated the entire negotiation. But it wasn't just the languages that impressed him. It was Jalen's intuitive understanding of cultural nuances, business etiquette, and diplomatic protocol. He didn't just translate words, he bridged worlds. When the German engineers discussed technical specifications, Jalen didn't just convert the language. He explained the cultural context behind their engineering approaches. When the Japanese executives expressed concerns about timeline flexibility, Jalen helped Edward understand that this wasn't just about schedules, but about face-saving and relationship building. For the French delegation's questions about market penetration, Jalen facilitated not just linguistic translation, but cultural translation, helping both sides understand not just what was being said, but what was meant. Within 2 hours, what had started as a failing $15 million deal had not only been saved, it had been expanded to $25 million. The international executives were not just satisfied. They were enthusiastic about the partnership, specifically because of their confidence in Jalen's ongoing involvement. As the delegations departed, each one made a point of personally thanking Jalen and expressing their hope that he would be involved in future negotiations. Edward watched this with growing understanding of just how catastrophic his earlier decision had been. The next morning, Edward Langston approached Jalen Morris's desk carrying a brass plaque and a folder of documents. His entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the imperious CEO, replaced by someone who had learned a profound lesson about respect and dignity. Jalen, he said, placing the plaque on the security desk where everyone could see it. Jalen Morris, security supervisor and chief international cultural consultant, fluent in 11 languages, UN-certified translator. You'll be splitting your time between security and our international division, Edward continued, handing Jalen the folder. Your salary is being increased 5-fold, effective immediately. We're also establishing a new department, International Cultural Relations, and I'd like you to head it up. As employees gathered around, spontaneously applauding, Edward addressed the entire lobby with a humility that surprised everyone who knew him. Yesterday, I called Jalen stupid. Today, he saved our company and taught me the most valuable lesson of my career. I learned that respect isn't about position or title. It's about recognizing the incredible worth and dignity in every single person, regardless of their role. Later that day, Savannah Brooks approached Jalen during his break. 11 languages, UN translator, and you never mentioned any of it. Why? Jalen smiled, the same modest smile he'd always worn. You never asked. Besides, every job has dignity. I was proud to be your security guard, just as I'm proud to help with international relations. That afternoon, Jalen sat at the head of a conference table facilitating complex negotiations between Italian investors and Korean partners. While still maintaining his beloved security position, he had insisted on keeping both roles. The security desk had become more than just a checkpoint to him. It was where he greeted the people who had shown him kindness during his darkest periods. The security desk had transformed from a simple workstation into a symbol of something much larger. Respect, dignity, and the profound truth that you never truly know who you're talking to. Every person who walked through those doors was greeted not just by a security guard, but by a reminder that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. Edward Langston was forever changed by the experience. He instituted new company policies about respect and dignity in the workplace. He started having lunch in the employee cafeteria instead of his executive dining room. Most importantly, he never again judged anyone by their job title or made assumptions about their capabilities. The story spread throughout the business community, becoming a powerful reminder about the hidden talents and experiences that people carry with them. Jalen Morris became something of a legend, not just at Langston Holdings, but in international business circles, where his story inspired others to look beyond superficial judgments. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story was how Jalen never sought revenge or harbored resentment. He continued to treat Edward Langston with the same professional respect he showed everyone, demonstrating a level of grace and dignity that taught everyone around him about the true meaning of character. After all, it turned out the stupid security guard knew more about business, dignity, and diplomacy than the CEO ever would. In the end, Jalen Morris proved that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions, your character, and your treatment of others. And sometimes, the most profound lessons come from the people we least expect to teach us. If the story moved you, don't just hit like, share it. Share it for every quiet hero who's been overlooked. Share it for every person judged by their uniform, not their worth. And if you believe the world needs more stories like Jalen's, subscribe, because sometimes the greatest power isn't in a title. It's in the dignity we carry, even when no one's watching.